Some injustice doesn't shout. It smiles. It laughs. It dismisses. What you are about to witness is not rare. It is routine. It is the world you walk through every day. This time, it was recorded. This time, they chose the wrong ones. The terminal buzzed with the restless hum of privilege. Polished shoes clicking across marble floors. Designer luggage rolling smoothly behind tailored suits and sparkling jewelry. At Gate 1A, where only the elite gathered to board first class, every detail screamed status glass partitions, velvet ropes, champagne trays balancing on manicured hands. Into this world of polished excess stepped Henry and Lillian Carter, hand in hand, moving with the quiet grace of people who had nothing to prove. Henry, tall and broad-shouldered, despite the silver streaking his hair, wore a simple gray suit that fit him like it had been made decades ago and loved ever since. Lillian, regal in a soft lavender dress, clutched a modest handbag and wore shoes polished with care, not wealth. Their presence sliced through the space like a whisper in a shouting crowd. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. A woman in designer heels whispered behind a manicured hand, "Are they lost?" A young man in a sharp blazer chuckled under his breath, nudging his companion. "Coach check-in is that way," he sneered. Brooke, the lead flight attendant at the gate, clocked their approach immediately. Her smile tightened. Her hands fluttered unnecessarily over the passenger list, as if searching for confirmation that surely, these two were in the wrong place. When Henry and Lillian reached the velvet rope, Brooke stepped forward with a smile so thin it could have sliced paper. "Excuse me," she said, voice syrupy with condescension. "First-class boarding is for Group 1 only." Henry offered a polite nod and held out 2 crisp boarding passes. Brooke barely glanced at them before sighing loudly enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "There must be a mistake," she said, fake typing furiously on her tablet. "Please step aside while we sort this out." Whispers rippled outward, like stones dropped in still water. "Maybe they won a contest," someone said. "Charity seats," another murmured. Lillian's hand tightened slightly around Henry's, but she said nothing, her chin lifting imperceptibly higher. Henry's voice was calm, steady, and unbothered. "Our names are on the list," he said. Brooke's eyes flickered with something cold and defensive. "Sir, please, you're holding up the boarding process." The line behind them shuffled impatiently. Brooke leaned closer, lowering her voice, but not her disdain. "Maybe you should wait by the economy gate. It'll be less confusing for everyone." A few chuckles erupted from behind the velvet rope. Henry's smile didn't falter, but the light in his eyes cooled several degrees. Lillian squeezed his arm once. A silent anchor. Around them, the world shrank to a series of judgmental glances, smirks, and sidelong snickers. No one offered help. No one questioned Brooke. No one wondered whether the problem was not with the couple before them, but with the mirror in their own eyes. And above it all, Brooke smiled brighter, certain of her authority, unaware that the ground beneath her feet had already begun to crack. Brooke pasted on a sickly sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes as she tapped her tablet harder, louder, drawing more attention, more judgment from the gathering crowd. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's just no way you're listed in first class. Maybe you should double-check your tickets at the economy service desk." Her voice carried effortlessly across the polished terminal, ensuring every waiting passenger could hear the subtle accusation that they didn't belong. A heavy-set man in a golf cap muttered under his breath, "Must have wandered in from the cheap seats." His wife chuckled nastily, clutching her designer purse closer to her chest, as if proximity alone could stain her with poverty. 2 teenagers, Phone cameras tilted upward, whispered excitedly, live streaming the scene with captions like, "When you lie about flying first class," giggling as they zoomed in shamelessly on Henry and Lillian's calm, dignified faces. Brooke crossed her arms with theatrical impatience, glancing at the crowd as if to say, "For your convenience." She added, dripping with sarcasm, "There's a customer service counter just down the hall. I'm sure they can help you sort this out." She gestured vaguely toward a distant corridor, where economy passengers formed snaking, endless lines. Henry's hand tightened slightly around the boarding passes, but he did not move, his stillness radiating a quiet fury that only the perceptive could sense. Lillian's gaze swept across the faces staring at them. The amused, the curious, the cruel. And for a brief moment, her smile flickered, not from shame, but from sadness. Brooke, emboldened by their silence, leaned forward over the podium, lowering her voice but spitting venom all the same. "We have an image to maintain in our premium cabins. Sir, I'm sure you understand." The words slithered across the air, thick with meaning, thick with history. Henry tilted his head slightly, studying her the way one might study an insect that didn't yet realize it had crawled into a fire. The murmurs behind them swelled. "They're holding everyone up." Someone snapped loudly, a woman with a diamond-encrusted phone case and an impatient scowl. "Just send them back already." Another man barked, adjusting his gold cufflinks with exaggerated disgust. Brooke smiled wider, sensing victory. "Sir, ma'am, if you don't move now, security will be called to assist," she said sweetly, waving over a nearby guard who had already started toward them, his posture bored, but ready, phones lifted higher. More whispers, more chuckles, more captions typed feverishly for social media fame. Lillian straightened her shoulders, her voice the first to slice through the chaos, low and unwavering. "Is this really how you welcome your guests?" Brooke blinked, thrown off for just a second, before doubling down. "We welcome first-class passengers with confirmed status, ma'am," she said, her tone a dagger, dressed in velvet. The security guard arrived, hand resting casually on his belt, eyes flicking over Henry and Lillian with the same detached suspicion one might reserve for shoplifters. The velvet rope between them and the plane shimmered in the overhead lights, a barrier built not of fabric, but of arrogance, ignorance, and centuries-old prejudice. And yet, through it all, Henry and Lillian stood motionless, weathering the storm with a dignity that made the mockery look small, pitiful, temporary. Because they knew what the others didn't. They knew what was coming. The guard stepped closer, his hand tightening slightly at his belt, as if he expected a confrontation, as if he wanted one. Brooke's voice rose above the murmurs, loud and theatrical. "Attention passengers at Gate 1A. We are experiencing a delay due to 2 individuals attempting to board without proper verification." Her words slicing through the terminal with brutal precision. Passengers turned eagerly, some standing on tiptoes to get a better view, others openly recording. Phones held high like weapons. The crowd's whispers turned to laughter, ugly and sharp. "Thought they could sneak into first class," someone muttered gleefully. Another chimed in. "This is embarrassing for them," as if humiliation was a spectator sport. Lillian gripped Henry's arm tighter, her knuckles whitening, but she said nothing. Not yet. Henry's jaw tightened, a flicker of steel flashing beneath his composed exterior. Brooke leaned over to the guard, stage whispering loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Probably bought economy and thought no one would notice." She giggled, high-pitched and venomous. The guard nodded, clearly bored, but eager to display authority. You'll need to leave the boarding area now, he said curtly, extending an arm. Henry didn't move, didn't flinch. He merely looked at Lillian, exchanged a glance that spoke volumes, history carved into every silent word between them. Generations of silent battles fought and endured. The teenagers on the live stream squealed with excitement, the comment section exploding. Fake it till you make it fail, entitled Much. This is why we need separate lines. The mob was gathering, not with torches and pitchforks, but with laughter and cameras, digital stones ready to throw. Brooke folded her arms, tapping her toe. If you don't move, we'll have you escorted out, she said, dripping with false pity. The heavy-set man with the golf cap shouted, "Send them packing already. Some of us have real tickets." Applause broke out. Real, ugly applause from the crowd, clapping and hooting as if expelling Henry, and Lillian would be some grand entertainment. Lillian blinked slowly, absorbing the cruelty like a stone wall absorbs rain. Henry took one slow step forward, the guard mirroring him like a predator, ready to pounce. Now. The guard barked. Brooke smirked triumphantly, already turning back to her tablet, ready to erase their names from the boarding manifest, as if they had never existed. But before she could finish, Henry's voice cut through the noise, low, controlled, resonant like a distant drumbeat before a storm. "Call your supervisor." 3 simple words, but they stopped the laughter, froze the applause, silenced even the cruelest tongues for half a heartbeat. Brooke blinked, confused, scoffed. "They'll tell you the same thing," she said dismissively. The teenagers cackled. The crowd murmured. Another guard approached, radio crackling, ready to drag them out. But Henry didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a phone. A simple, old model. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth or power. He dialed one number, pressed it to his ear, and said 4 words that would shatter everything around them. "Activate Executive Protocol 4. The moment the words left Henry's mouth, a ripple of unease spread through the gate area. Brooke paused mid-tap on her tablet. The guard's hand froze just inches from Henry's shoulder. Nearby passengers shifted nervously, sensing a change they couldn't yet name. A second later, the airport's overhead speakers crackled sharply, drawing startled glances upward. "Attention all personnel. Executive Protocol 4, initiated at Gate 1A. Immediate lockdown authorized. Stand by for executive arrival." The mechanical voice was clinical, detached, but the impact was explosive. The color drained from Brooke's face so fast it was almost comical. The guards stiffened, exchanging confused, panicked looks. Whispers erupted among the passengers. Someone muttered, "What the hell is Protocol 4? Another asked, "Is this serious?" The heavy-set man with the golf cap stopped mid-snicker, his mouth hanging open. Henry slipped his phone back into his pocket with the casual air of a man ordering coffee. Lillian smoothed Caleb's hair. "No, not Caleb. Not here." She smoothed the creases of her modest handbag, her movements calm, deliberate, regal, across the terminal. The glass doors burst open with a pneumatic hiss, and a convoy of black-suited men and women swept in, like a wave of precision. Leading them was a tall woman in an executive blazer, her ID badge gleaming under the sterile airport lights. Senior Vice President of Operations Global Aviation Holdings, the parent company of the airline. They all thought they understood. She didn't walk, she strode, and every staff member instinctively stepped backward, creating a trembling path straight to Henry and Lillian, without hesitation, without a glance at Brooke or the guards. The vice president stopped before Henry and bowed her head in deference. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said, voice low and reverent. "We are deeply sorry for the unacceptable treatment you have endured. The board has been alerted, and all operational control of this flight, this gate, and this crew is now under your authority." The gate fell into stunned, gasping silence. Brooke stumbled backward, whispering, "What? What is happening?" But no one answered her. The guards stepped away from Henry and Lillian, as if scorched. Passengers dropped their phones to their sides, filming forgotten. A few even lowered their heads, realizing too late the enormity of their mistake. The vice president continued. "Per company charter, as the principal owners of Monarch Air, you have full discretion over personnel and passenger decisions effective immediately." The words echoed like a bomb dropped into still water. Henry finally moved, stepping forward with the slow, unbreakable authority of a king reclaiming his stolen throne. His voice cut through the stunned silence. "The first thing I want," he said, eyes locked onto Brooke, "is accountability." Brooke's knees buckled slightly, her mouth working soundlessly. The guards looked anywhere but at Henry, anywhere but at the disaster they had helped create. Passengers shuffled uneasily, trapped witnesses to a reckoning they could no longer escape. And in that moment, every smirk, every cruel laugh, every whispered insult turned to ash in their throats, because standing before them was not a mistake, not a charity case, not an inconvenience, but the very owners of the world they thought they ruled. And judgment, true judgment, was only just beginning. The air in Gate 1A thickened until it felt almost impossible to breathe. Passengers clutched their phones tighter, some slowly lowering them in shame, others too stunned to move. Brooke swayed where she stood, her face draining of all color, as the vice president turned to address the crowd, her voice ringing clear and cold across the terminal. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to formally introduce the owners of Monarch Air, Mr. Henry Carter and Mrs. Lillian Carter. Without them, none of us would be here. None of you would be flying today." A gasp surged through the assembled passengers, a collective realization crashing down like a tidal wave. The man in the golf cap actually staggered backward, bumping into the velvet rope he had once guarded so jealously. The teenagers who had live-streamed the humiliation gaped in horror, their phones trembling in their hands. Brooke's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. They're the owners," she stammered, barely audible. The guard who had reached for Henry earlier now stood at rigid attention, sweating under his cap. The vice president continued mercilessly. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter are not only the founders, but the majority shareholders of Monarch Air and its international subsidiaries, including the very lounge and premium services you so eagerly denied them." She let the words hang there, a noose tightening around every guilty neck. Henry stepped forward slowly, every eye magnetized to his movement. Lillian beside him, graceful and unbothered, her presence an unshakable pillar of quiet might. Henry's voice, when it came, was soft, yet carried the undeniable weight of command. "We built this airline to open doors, not close them. We built it to lift people up, not tear them down." His gaze swept across the crowd, landing briefly on every face that had sneered, chuckled, or looked away. "But today, you showed us how far we still have to go." Silence deeper than any before swallowed the terminal. Brooke whimpered, a sound so small it was almost pitiful. "I didn't know," she whispered, as if ignorance could ever be an excuse. Henry's eyes locked onto her, hard as iron. "You didn't care to know," he said simply, not with anger, but with the devastating finality of a door closing forever. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Some passengers looked at their shoes, unable to meet the weight of what they had helped create. Others wiped at their eyes. The heavy-set man with the golf cap tried to slip away unnoticed, but it was far too late for escape. Henry turned back to the vice president, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Begin removals, effective immediately." The vice president nodded sharply, already signaling to her team, and with that, the reckoning began, swift and public, as the true owners of Monarch Air reclaimed the dignity that had never truly left them. The vice president lifted her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen as new orders transmitted across the airport network. The overhead monitors at Gate 1A flickered and changed, replacing boarding information with a stark red message. Boarding suspended, executive intervention in progress. Gasps rose from the crowd as security personnel in black suits materialized from the edges of the terminal, sharp-eyed and stone-faced, not the mall cop guards who had grabbed Henry, but corporate security answering directly to the Carters themselves. The vice president spoke again, her tone clipped and merciless. "Brooke Ellis, you are hereby terminated for cause, effective immediately. Surrender your badge and credentials." Brooke let out a small, broken sound, her hands trembling violently as she unclipped her badge. She tried to stammer an apology, but no words came, only helpless sobs. The security agents flanked her, escorting her away as the cameras that had once eagerly filmed Henry's humiliation now captured her walk of shame. The guard who had manhandled Henry was next, stripped of his badge and ejected from the gate without ceremony. The crowd that had so recently laughed and cheered now shifted uncomfortably, some recording the downfall, others too ashamed to look. The vice president wasn't finished, her voice cutting through the rising murmurs like a scalpel. Passengers who engaged in harassing or discriminatory behavior toward Mr. and Mrs. Carter are no longer welcome aboard Monarch Air. Your bookings have been canceled. Refunds issued at our discretion. Please leave the terminal. Shrieks of protest erupted. The man with the golf cap blustered, "I didn't do anything wrong." Even as video evidence of his earlier remarks played on nearby screens, security moved swiftly, ushering the offenders out one by one, their furious protests drowned by the cold efficiency of justice in motion. The teenagers who had live-streamed the entire event cried and begged, but it was no use. Their own videos were their damning testimony. Henry and Lillian stood motionless through it all, serene, untouched, while around them, the false world built on arrogance and ignorance collapsed like a rotten shell. Passengers not involved, those who had simply watched in horror, now stepped aside, some bowing their heads, some mouthing apologies they didn't dare speak aloud, others reaching for their children, pulling them closer, as if to shield them from the ugliness they themselves had allowed to fester. Caleb, wide-eyed, peeked up at Lillian, who knelt and whispered something in his ear that made him smile, small and brave, a ripple of hope against the dark tide. And above it all, the terminal buzzed with a new kind of energy, not of mockery, not of division, but of reckoning, swift and final, the world shifting back into its rightful balance under the quiet, undeniable weight of true power. As the last of the offenders were escorted out, under the watchful eyes of security, a hush settled over Gate 1A, not the uneasy silence of guilt, but the tentative quiet of something new, struggling to be born. Henry turned to the vice president and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of mountains. "Not everyone chose cruelty," he said, and the vice president nodded quickly, understanding, without needing further instruction. She tapped her tablet once, and a young woman in a modest blue uniform was summoned forward. Her name tag read, Isabella Reyes. Her hands fidgeted nervously as she approached, her wide brown eyes darting between Henry, Lillian, and the powerful executives flanking them. "Miss Reyes," Henry said, his smile warm and genuine. "You saw what others ignored. You treated us with respect when you thought no one was watching." Isabella blinked, stunned. She had merely offered a polite smile earlier, when Brooke had started her cruelty. She had whispered to the guard to double-check before jumping to conclusions. Small gestures, invisible at the time, but remembered now. Remembered by the only eyes that mattered. "For your integrity," Henry continued. "You are being promoted immediately to Senior Guest Services Manager, with full benefits and a personal commendation on your record." A gasp went through the remaining crowd. Real, this time, honest. Isabella's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling over her cheeks. She tried to speak, but only a broken whisper escaped. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Henry reached out and shook her hand firmly. Lillian leaned in, brushing Isabella's shoulder with a motherly gentleness. "Never let this world make you forget who you are," she said softly, and Isabella nodded through her tears. The passengers who remained clapped now, not mockery, not sarcasm, but real, aching applause. Applause for kindness, for dignity, for the stubborn, vital human decency that had survived the rot. Caleb clapped too, his little hands slapping joyfully. His laughter lifting into the stale terminal air like a fresh wind. And for the first time that day, maybe for the first time in a long time, the people of Gate 1A smiled without cruelty, smiled without judgment, smiled because in that moment, they remembered how. As the applause ebbed into a reverent hush, all eyes turned to Lillian, who stepped forward with a grace that seemed to hush even the restless hum of the terminal. She held herself tall, her lavender dress catching the soft afternoon light, her silver hair like a crown, earned not through wealth, but through a lifetime of battles fought with quiet dignity. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice, when it rose, was clear and strong enough to fill the space on its own. "Many years ago," she began, her eyes sweeping the crowd, "there were places we could not sit, doors we could not walk through, flights we could not board." Her words hung heavy, trembling with the weight of history. "We built Monarch Air because we believed the sky should belong to everyone, not just those deemed acceptable by the narrow eyes of prejudice." A murmur rippled through the passengers, some bowing their heads in shame, others lifting their faces, drawn upward by the gravity of her truth. "Today," she continued, her voice steady, unyielding, "you reminded me why that dream still matters, why it still needs defending." Her gaze hardened slightly, not cruel, but relentless. Dignity is not a luxury. It is not a privilege. It is a birthright, and no amount of wealth, no title on a ticket, no velvet rope can grant or take it away. Caleb stared up at her, wide-eyed, clutching Henry's hand tightly, the child absorbing a lesson deeper than any school could teach. "When you see a stranger," Lillian said, her voice softening, "do not look for labels. Do not search for worth in their clothes or their skin. Look for the humanity, the dreams, the battles you cannot see." A tear slid silently down Isabella's cheek. Others followed in the crowd. A collective softening, a collective remembering. Lillian smiled then, radiant and unstoppable. A smile carved from the bedrock of survival and hope. Because one day, she finished, her voice lowering into something almost sacred. "It might be your mother they doubt, your father they mock, your child they turn away, and when that day comes, you will pray someone sees them not as a problem, but as a person." She stepped back, then, No grand gesture, no dramatic flourish, just a woman returning to her place beside the man she loved, having laid bare a truth so simple, so devastatingly powerful, that it left the terminal trembling in its silence, a silence not of guilt this time, but of awakening. The golden afternoon light stretched longer across the marble floor of the terminal, casting Henry and Lillian in a warm, quiet glow as they turned away from Gate 1A, their steps unhurried, their backs straight, the velvet ropes that once barred them, now parted without a word. Passengers moved aside instinctively, some lowering their heads in shame, others lifting their faces with something new glinting in their eyes. Respect, awe, perhaps even hope. Caleb skipped slightly ahead, his small laughter breaking the heavy air like a bell, calling people back to their better selves. Security guards saluted quietly as they passed. The vice president bowed once more. Passengers who had once mocked now watched them leave with silent reverence, knowing they had witnessed something they would never forget. As Henry and Lillian approached the glass doors leading out to the tarmac, a sleek black town car waited. Engine purring softly, a driver standing crisply at attention. But before they could step outside, a figure hesitated near the gate. Isabella, the young woman who had been promoted, holding her phone tightly in both hands, her chest rising and falling with nervous energy. She bit her lip, glanced once at the door, then made a decision. She strode forward, catching up to them just as they reached the threshold. "Mrs. Carter," Isabella called, voice trembling but strong. Lillian turned, smiling warmly. Isabella drew a shaky breath. "I just wanted to say, after today, I'm applying for the management leadership program, something I never thought someone like me could do." Her words tumbled out in a rush. "Because you showed me that dignity doesn't ask permission." Lillian's smile deepened. She reached out and touched Isabella's shoulder, pride shining in her eyes. "Walk through every door like you built it yourself," she said, soft but fierce. Isabella nodded, blinking back tears. The town car door opened with a soft click. Henry helped Lillian inside, then followed, Caleb clambering happily between them. The door closed with a satisfying thud. The car pulled away smoothly, leaving the terminal, the judgment, the pain, all shrinking in the rearview mirror. Ahead of them stretched endless sky, endless road, endless possibility. Inside the terminal, Isabella stood rooted to the spot, watching the car disappear into the horizon. Her phone still clutched tightly in her hand, her future wide open before her. The lessons of this day etched into her bones forever. The town car melted into the golden horizon, swallowed by the soft hum of a world still spinning, still learning. The terminal behind them slowly returned to its routines. Boarding calls, hurried footsteps, the low murmur of lives moving forward. But something invisible had changed. Something unshakable had been planted in the hearts of everyone who had watched, who had judged, who had stayed silent, and who had chosen, too late, to see. Across the world, videos of the incident rippled across screens, a tide of reckoning washing over millions. Captions flooded social media, not mocking, but reverent. Dignity doesn't wear a label. The real owners walk among us. Kindness is never wasted. Somewhere, a young boy watched the footage on his cracked phone, wide-eyed, his mind igniting with the first fragile sparks of a dream, bigger than any he had dared to imagine. Somewhere else, an old woman whispered a prayer of thanks for the justice she had lived long enough to witness. The screen faded to black, and over that darkness, Henry's voice rose, deep, steady, eternal, not a shout, not a roar, but the quiet thunder of a truth that could not be silenced. The worth of a soul, he said, is not stitched into the fabric they wear, not printed on the ticket they hold, not weighed by the glances of the ignorant. His voice dipped lower, pulling the audience closer. Greatness, he continued, does not announce itself with gold or silk. A pause, heavy, aching. Sometimes it walks quietly into a room and waits for the world to recognize it. Another beat of silence, then the final line, etched into the darkness like a blade of light, sharp enough to wound, strong enough to heal. The next time you choose to look down on a stranger, pray. You're not staring at the ones who built the very ground you stand on. They laughed. They judged. They humiliated. But they didn't ask. Who built the seats they sat on? Who owned the air they breathed? Next time you look down on a stranger, pray the ground beneath you doesn't belong to them.